The Life and Deaths of the USS Cylclops. At some point on her journey, the Cyclops would make a deviation from her original course. Due to the handicap of her damaged starboard engine limiting her to no more than 10 knots, 5 less than her top speed and 4 less than her usual rate of travel, she would sail over 2,000 nautical miles north, eventually passing into the Caribbean Sea. Without warning, on March 3rd, she would arrive at the island of Barbados, most likely at the capital of Bridgetown and its principal natural harbor, the crescent-shaped waters of Carlisle Bay. In so doing, Lieutenant Commander Worley would send out a message to inform the Navy of his arrival there. Quote, "Arrived Barbados, West Indies, 1730, 5:30 p.m. for bunker coal. Arrived Baltimore, Maryland, March 13th. Notify Office Director Naval Auxiliaries. Commander, Cyclops." At the time, Barbados was still a colony of the British Empire, the US's ally in the war. This was an unscheduled stop for the collier, however. As such, her captain had to follow a usual protocol, which required that he go to visit the US consulate on the island, doing so on the following day. The US consul to Barbados at the time, a Charles Ludlow Livingston, received Lieutenant Commander Worley as well as the higher-ranking US Consul General to Rio de Janeiro himself, Alfred Gottschalk. Gottschalk had tagged along with Worley on his visit to the consulate, possibly to discuss diplomatic affairs with Livingston. Brockhurst Livingston, the latter's 13-year-old son, would record more than a decade later that the ship's captain, Commander Worley, and several other guests including Gottschalk, had tea at the consulate. Charles Ludlow himself had learned much of the purpose of the Cyclops and her crew in being on the island. According to a report that he would file later to the Office of Naval Intelligence, he noticed a number of key aspects about her crew, her captain, and her as a ship. Worley had told him during their meeting that he required 600 tons of coal. By then, he had sufficient aboard his ship to reach the more northerly island of Bermuda, some 1,200 nautical miles further north. However, his ship's engines were still in poor condition. Worley noted that the Cyclops was in need of a resupply, and he did not have sufficient funds on him for the necessary transactions. As such, he requested Charles, as the US consul, to make the payments for him. Charles acquiesced and helped him to purchase 1 ton of fresh meat, 1 ton of flour, and 1,000 pounds of vegetables, costing him $775. This comes up to between $13,000 to over $16,000 worth of supplies in today's currency. During their conversation, Charles noticed that Worley was unusually reserved. He would find out through other sources that his crew referred to him as, quote, "the damned Dutchman." He learned that he was disliked by other officers aboard and that there had even been a disturbance on the ship prior to its arrival at Barbados. This was most likely an attempted mutiny that Nervague later pointed out in his testimony. Both men alluded to one having taken place, which the lieutenant commander had quickly stomped out. One man was believed to have been executed and a few others locked up. Further, the ship was transporting 3 general courts-martial prisoners in her brig. These men had been transferred to the Cyclops from the fleet operating in the waters off Brazil. All of them had been convicted for the murder of a shipmate and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 50 to 99 years. According to Charles's son Brockhurst, before the group of guests had departed, they had signed his sister's autograph book, noting that their signatures were, quote, "probably the latest ones in existence." No one, of course, thought there was any danger in the voyage, he would go on to say. At around 5 o'clock or 1700 hours, Worley, Gottschalk, and their group would leave the consulate. Brockhurst and others would watch them from the beach as they returned aboard the Cyclops. By then, the ship was at a slight list and floating low in the water, leaving her plimsoll line submerged. Now with at least 309 people aboard, the ship issued several blasts from her whistle and began to back out of the bay. Then, moving forward, she steamed south, back out onto the sea. Supposedly, her last message after clearing port was, quote, "weather fair, all well." She presumably attempted to resume her course for Baltimore on that evening of March 4th. Brockhurst notes, quote, "We did not consider this course odd until a few weeks later, when we got a cable requesting full details of her visit to Barbados." The Cyclops was due at Baltimore on March 13th. However, that Wednesday would come and go with no sign of the ship. So would the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. No further messages would be received from her. no SOS signal would ever be sent out. The USS Cyclops would simply and suddenly stop communicating. When she failed to make Baltimore on March 23rd, she was officially declared missing. Every naval ship in the vicinity of the Caribbean, from Cuba to Puerto Rico, was alerted of the situation and commenced a search of her entire track from Barbados. They kept a keen eye out for a massive debris field, presupposing that a German submarine had torpedoed her, or that perhaps an uncharted minefield had sunk her. All the while, the disconcerting fact remained that no SOS signal was ever received from the ship, something that was of course standard protocol for a vessel facing imminent destruction, at least if she even had the time to send one. No debris was ever found. There was no driftwood. There were no life preservers. There was no floating cargo, coal, or manganese ore. There were no bodies. For all intents and purposes, it seemed to the bewildered Navy that the 19,000-ton USS Cyclops, her 11,000-ton consignment of ore, as well as all her passengers, crew, and officers, over 309 souls, had simply vanished off the face of the Atlantic. As the First World War was still in its final months, the Navy made no public announcement that the Cyclops was missing. Its upper echelons withheld the information about her disappearance until there was more evidence that something had actually gone wrong. American wireless stations continually intercepted messages from enemy craft, but heard no call for assistance. Radio queries combed the entire Atlantic 24/7 for 10 days straight, but came away with no solid answer as to sightings of the ship. All commercial vessels were requested to look out for wreckage that might indicate the fate of the Cyclops. French and American ships searched trade routes between the two ports, but found no trace either of her or of those that had been aboard. Across the board, their searches came up empty. American diplomatic agents abroad were instructed to seek any information on her. The German Navy itself, still an enemy of the US, was also investigated. Wireless messages were examined from the German naval headquarters, most likely the North Sea Naval Station at Wilhelmshaven that managed the High Seas Fleet. Missives from the headquarters to German submarines were decoded. No answer was revealed on this front either. No submarine commanders had come forward, either publicly or in their private missives to their superiors on the mainland, to lay claim to having sunk the collier. Moreover, even though submarines were known to haunt the Caribbean Sea, and the lone ship would have made for a perfect target, there were no submarines present along the route that the Cyclops was suspected to have taken. On April 15th, 1 month after she failed to make port, the Navy finally released the news to the Associated Press that the collier was overdue. This was met with the open concern and shock of many across the nation, a number of whom were the families and loved ones of the lost 309. There were calls and demands from family members and journalists for more answers which the Navy was itself still struggling to provide. The exhaustive search was continued even 100 days later into the month of June, with no luck, by which time a decision had to be made. On June 1st, 1918, Franklin D. Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, declared the Cyclops to be officially lost with all hands. All 309 aboard were pronounced deceased, much to the anxiety turned grief of their worried families and friends. The First World War would end on November 11th of that same year. Though many of its survivors would strive or struggle to pick up the pieces of old lives or to create new ones in the wake of the war, the fate of the USS Cyclops would remain an enduring mystery, one difficult in its own right to fully piece together over 100 years later. On March 2nd, 1918, just a day prior to the Cyclops' last known stop, the steamship and tanker Amulco departed from the island of Barbados. She was bound for Boston carrying as her cargo a fresh delivery of molasses. On March 9th, she was traveling just off the coast of Virginia when she supposedly spotted the collier on her way to Baltimore, the latter having possibly caught up to her or at least come within sight. This occurrence was even recorded in the ship's log. The weather off the Virginia Capes on the following Sunday, March 10th, was reportedly violent. W.J. Riley, third officer aboard the Amulco, had reported to the Washington Times newspaper that he believed the Cyclops had been lost in a storm that swept the seas 125 miles south of the island of Nantucket. The Amulco herself was caught in this storm and received damages to the extent of $130,000, roughly $2,600,000 in today's currency. Riley believed that the speed of the Cyclops would have placed her directly within the destructive path of the gale. To add to that, various weather services reported a massive destructive storm in the general vicinity of the Capes. It is proposed that a series of problems compounded together, accentuated by the harsh weather, to cause the ship to sink such a short distance from Baltimore. At the time, this idea served to heartbreakingly debunk the claims of Mistress Samuel W. Worley, the wife of the Cyclops' captain, who made a statement the day before that the Cyclops was safe. Her claims had been based on rumors, as well as a telephone conversation she'd had with a friend, a naval officer, who assured her that the Cyclops was safe and would be heard from shortly. It was discovered that the source of the officer's information was indefinite, and it could be argued that he was simply trying to offer the worried wife of Lieutenant Commander Worley what comfort he could. However, this theory of the Cyclops' sinking off the Capes is still in doubt. Given that she was due in Baltimore on the 13th, it made little sense for her to be so close to her final destination, so far ahead of her scheduled date of arrival. Even if it was her captain's intention to arrive ahead of schedule, it would not have been a realistic goal. The ship's speed was reduced to an estimated 240 nautical miles per day because of her damaged starboard engine, and was 1,800 nautical miles away from Baltimore. She was sailing at 10 knots. As such, it would have taken her at least a week to arrive at her destination from Barbados. That, if anything, would have made any sightings of her on March 11th or later far more believable. Not the 9th. Simply put, she could not have been there off the Capes. Or at the very least, she could not have been the same ship spotted by the Amulco. Even if by some maritime miracle the Cyclops had indeed arrived off the Virginia Capes on that Saturday, it would have been under the tensest conditions. Both the ship's surviving engine and its officers would essentially be fraying at the edges, the former from the Herculean strain of such a feat, the latter at what most sane seamen would see to be an incredibly unnecessary and dangerous risk. Something that would have further burdened the already strained relationship between them and their skipper. Moreover, to further discount this theory, the Amulco's captain would later deny the claim of the sighting set forth by his third officer. Kraken attacks and mass alien abductions aside, there is still another matter to be addressed, that being the rest of the Proteus line, the sisters of the Cyclops. In their fates, which all came about within the span of just a year of each other, can that of their late sister perhaps be discerned? We can dismiss the US Jupiter out of hand. After serving in the First World War, she would go on decades later to serve in the Second, this time as America's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley. She would operate in the Pacific Theater. However, on February 27, 1941, after a Japanese air attack would see her engines disabled just off Java, US naval forces would scuttle her, sending her down to the bottom of the Pacific to avoid her capture by the enemy. The USS Proteus, the flagship of the Proteus Collier line, also served all the way to the end of the First World War. She would later be decommissioned and sold to Sanguinay Terminals Limited, and operated under the umbrella of the Canadian Merchant Navy. She would, however, meet her end sometime after November 23, 1941. Both she and all 58 of her crew members would be lost, vanishing without any perceivable cause within the Bermuda Triangle. The USS Nereus would also survive the First World War. She would be decommissioned and sold almost 2 decades later to the Aluminum Company of Canada. She would transit shipments of cargo from the Caribbean to aluminum plants in Canada and the United States. That is, until sometime after December 10, 1941. Steaming from the island of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, she would disappear along the very same route as her Cyclopean sister had 22 years earlier. Her loss, like that of her sisters, would also take place within the bounds of the Bermuda Triangle, and would mark the end of the sisterhood. 2 things must be brought to the fore. First is that it is hard to prove that the fabled mystic forces of the Bermuda Triangle hated the Proteus sisters specifically, much harder at least than it is to prove something else. The Proteus class possessed structural features that would have made their demise that much more connected. Namely, they had a problem with rolling in heavy weather. If the Cyclops was indeed caught in a storm somewhere during her route, it would be feasible to assume that the 11,000 tons of manganese ore stored in her coal bunkers would have shifted and eventually tipped her off balance. It would have tilted her at a sharper angle until she eventually capsized. It should be remembered that her plimsoll line was recorded as being underwater by the time of her departure for Rio. That was just with 10,000 tons of coal. Manganese ore is denser and heavier. For her last shipment, she received over 1,000 tons more of it than the weight of the coal she arrived with. The report of the survey board in Rio stated that the coal had been properly secured, but Worley had arrested the only lieutenant who knew how to properly secure manganese ore in his room after a dispute. Keep in mind that the board I'm referring to is the same one that recommended she chance a voyage back to the States for repairs. She would risk the gambit of open waters at half strength rather than waiting longer to receive those repairs at Rio, or at least traveling a shorter distance to somewhere that could fix her. Even with her cargo supposedly securely loaded, she would later be seen at Barbados with her plimsoll line still underwater and the whole thing even partly listing. To take things further, there were reports that she previously suffered from hull damage due to a coal fire, hull failures, or separation of pipes. These are not signs one would necessarily attribute to a healthy ship. A theory advanced by US Navy Admiral George Van Doyer was that her acidic coal cargo could over time have seriously eroded her I-beams. These were longitudinal support beams within the ship, whose slow corrosion from shipment after shipment of mildly acidic materials made them more likely to break under stress. A combination of weakened structures, dense ore, and heavy seas would be the most likely cause for her loss. Then there is the area in which the Cyclops had traveled. The Bermuda Triangle, though of course not recognized as such by the US Board of Geographic Environmental Considerations, was an unpredictable region of ocean meteorologically until very recently. The majority of Atlantic tropical storms, hurricanes, rogue waves, and other natural phenomenon pass through it. Prior to days of improved weather forecasting, these dangerous storms crept up on and claimed many ships. The intermingling Gulf Stream contributes to this as well, with rapid, sometimes violent changes in weather. Additionally, the large number of islands in the Caribbean Sea creates many areas of shallow water that can be treacherous to ship navigation. Absent direct proof of the ship herself, we're left to connect a few dots. It appears most likely that a synergy of events caused the loss of the Cyclops. The ship was operating on a single shaft because of the cracked cylinder that had knocked her starboard engine out of commission. This reduced her speed and maneuverability, and left her at risk of greater damage if she were to suffer a further engineering problem. She was loaded deeply, at or beyond her marks. This cargo was new to the ship. It is not clear that the officers, crew, and stevedores in Brazil knew how to properly load, stow, and trim the ore. There have been reports that she previously suffered hull damage due to a coal fire, as well as other infrastructural issues. She also had problems with extreme rolls and bad weather. On at least one occasion, it was reported that her cargo had shifted in her coal bunkers. Water entering the hull would affect the ship's stability and buoyancy, probably resulting in progressive flooding, and ultimately causing her to sink. This process may have been unperceivable to the bridge watch, particularly if it occurred during dark or extreme weather. They would have had little notice that the ship was about to sink. If Cyclops had not previously lost her remaining engine, she may have continued to steam along, driving the bow underwater or capsizing. This was a conclusion even Josephus Daniels, then Secretary of the Navy, would come to accept as the most possible theory. Though this may not have happened in the case of the March 9th storm, it could have taken place in any number of the other storm systems that populated the region, ready to toss or split the lethargic, heavily laden ship in two. The weight of its own charge and the power of nature could and may have sentenced her to the bottom of the Atlantic, along with her cargo and crew. There have been many reported sightings of the ship over the years, from diplomatic agents who mistook a German ship for her, to a diver who mistook a wreck for her remains. However, to this day, the grave of the Cyclops has not been discovered. Nevertheless, Cyclops is generally regarded as the last major US Navy warship to lie undiscovered in the world's oceans. After the recent run of nearly rediscovered warships like the USS Indianapolis and carriers such as the USS Lexington, it seems likely that the ship will eventually be found. Cylclops was a large ship, and, thanks to the manganese, should have an unusual magnetic signature that will make her easier to find. When she is rediscovered, it is said by some that we will likely find that neither aliens nor Atlantean technology were responsible, only human error. Until then, however, she will remain somewhere within the darkness on the bottom of the Atlantic. Until then, the words of President Woodrow Wilson will remain true for the fate of the Lost 309, as well as for the century-long delay of closure for those generations of family that they left behind. Only God and the sea know what happened to the great ship.